Welcome back to Naval Battles That Never Happened. It's been a while, but my last video is sitting at a few thousand views, thanks entirely to Drakenfell, and I'm getting a trickle of new subscribers. So after hitting 100, I figured it's time for another video, which has been in the works since about 2020, but whatever. Today, we've got an engagement between battleships from the world's greatest superpowers, Russia and the United States. That's right, this is it. We're doing it, but in 1904. Let me explain. Now, without going too heavy into 21st century politics, Russia and the US, they got some beef. I know, it's hard to believe. But to resolve this beef without, well, that happening, US President Joe, not Trump Biden, and Russian President Vladimir Dank Memes Putin agreed to settle their differences with a naval battle between each nation's best battleship. Now, since neither country has a battleship in their current fleet, their only option is to go back in time to when both countries had comparable battleships. Using the magical powers of YouTube, both leaders were sent back to 1904 to prepare their respective vessels for combat. No, don't question it. Just, we're going with it. So starting out, both leaders had to convince their countries to actually give them a battleship, which you would think would be kind of hard since these were the ultimate weapons of their day. But surprisingly, neither of them had much of a problem. Biden had no trouble blending into the political scene of 1904 America because, well, I mean, his thinking is already stuck in the early 1900s, so it kind of works out. Within a few days of name dropping and using mostly time-appropriate slang, Biden was a captain in the U.S. Navy and was put in command of the USS Kentucky. Putin didn't have much trouble either, but for different reasons. He had just showed up at the harbor, shot the captain in the head, and declared himself the ship's new commander. Yeah, it's a little basic, but it worked and nobody questioned it. Also, Rasputin was there with him. Yeah, I don't know. He just showed up at Putin's side, and again, nobody questioned it. I mean, nobody would question it nowadays. They sure as hell wouldn't question it back then. And just how did Biden and Putin get so good at commanding battleships? With today's sponsor, World of Warships. Get conscripted now and drive the greatest boats of all time, like this one and this one. And I don't know. We're not sponsored by World of Warships. But you should check out War Thunder. Play as one of 100 billion highly rendered fighting vehicles and go shoot stuff. All right, there's no sponsor. There's no sponsor. Moving on. So both Biden and Putin sailed their respective battleships to the original point of contention between the US and Russia, the Bering Strait. The Retvizan headed from Port Arthur, traveling around the Korean Peninsula and the Chinese coast to the Bering Sea. Meanwhile, Kentucky hugged the west coast of the United States all the way to the strait. Then they both headed for the Diomede Islands, which was their agreed-upon battleground. Don't question it. Now, let's take a moment to go over the ships. Retvizan was built as part of Tsar Nicholas II's expansion of the Russian Navy in the late 1890s. The Tsar was seeking a port along the Pacific that didn't freeze over for part of the year, because Russia. And through some bullshit international politics, they ended up with Port Arthur. Russia needed more battleships to maintain parity with Japan, their main rival in the area, so they contracted a shipbuilder in the United States to build one for them, along with a cruiser. Retvizan's design was based on the Russian battleship Potemkin. Yeah, that Potemkin. But with a few minor changes, like a longer hull and more coal stowage at the expense of secondary armament. Despite a few minor issues during construction, Retvizan was launched in October of 1900, underwent her sea trials in October of 1901, and was commissioned into the Russian Navy in March of 1902. Retvizan's armament is one of the most key factors of this engagement. Like every Russian pre-dreadnought, Retvizan's primary armament was two turrets containing twin 1895 model 12-inch 40 caliber naval guns. These guns were based on a similar Krupp gun that the Russians adopted in 1886 and were sufficiently powerful, but had a slow rate of fire, and a redesign was manufactured locally. The redesigned guns still had a slow rate of fire, but improvements in turret designs and machinery allowed them to increase their fire rate to about one shot every 90 seconds by the time of the Borodino class. However, most ships from this time period could fire one shot per minute with their main guns, making them about 50% faster. And considering even with fire control, these ships weren't very good at hitting each other, the Russians kind of had a major disadvantage from that slow rate of fire. The secondary armament consisted of 12 French-made 6-inch 45 caliber Canet pattern 1892 quick-firing guns along the hull, with 8 in casemates and 4 mounted on the upper deck. Additionally, Retvizan carried a large number of small guns to deal with torpedo boats. She also carried 6 torpedo tubes pointing all over the place, because of course she did. All of these weapons were of good quality, but it's worth mentioning that most of the smaller guns were in relatively exposed mounts, although this was typical for the time. Retvizan used croup armor that took up about a quarter of the ship's displacement. The belt and turret armor was a maximum of 9 inches, while the deck was 2 to 3 inches thick, while bulkheads, casemates, and other mountings were thinner at anywhere from 2 to 7 inches. Overall, the armor was sufficient, and it allowed Retvizan to make 18 knots. Now, I already went over the American Kearsarge class in my video about St. John's Harbor, but I'll give a quick overview. USS Kentucky, designated BB-6, was the second and last ship of the Kearsarge class, launched in 1898 along with her sister. She was built as a coastal defense battleship and sat low in the water, giving her poor seakeeping capability. Her armament had a unique layout. The ship's main battery of Mark I 13-inch guns were in 2 twin turrets, one fore and one aft, as usual. However, the rather heavy secondary armament of Mark III 8-inch guns were in 2 twin turrets fixed atop the 13-inch gun turrets. Being fixed to the main armament, this meant that the secondary battery could not be trained independently. However, on the upside, she could deliver a broadside with all 4 8-inch guns, rather than having 8 spread out along the hull, but still only being able to fire 4 in a broadside. This arrangement proved ineffective as the firing of the main guns disrupted the crew of the secondary guns. Additionally, Kearsarge carried 14 Mark III 5-inch guns in armored casemates, along with 20 Mark I 6-pounder guns with little to no armor protecting them. She also carried 8 1-pounder guns for defense against torpedo boats, and 4 torpedo tubes, of course. Her belt armor was 16.5 inches at its thickest and 15 to 17 inches on the turrets. While this was completely made of the less efficient Harvey face-hardened armor, the thickness of the armor provided more protection than Retvizan's croup armor. Kentucky could only make 16 knots, however, but since she was intended to be a coastal battleship, this was considered adequate. Retvizan arrived on the west coast of Big Diomede, the Russian island, on June 24th at 09:45 hours and steamed north along its coast at 12 knots. At the same time, Kentucky reached the eastern coast of Little Diomede, heading north along the coast at 10 knots. Because of their exact courses, neither ship spotted the other before arriving at the islands. Surface conditions were Sea State 3, and the wind was behind both ships, blowing 13 knots to the north. At 09:54, the ships cleared the northernmost point of their respective islands, and spotters aboard both immediately noticed each other at 5,000 yards. Biden ordered Kentucky to battle stations, and the crew performed their loading drills in good time. However, little did the Americans know that the guns of the Retvizan were already loaded, thanks to some precognition on the part of Rasputin. The sorcerer cackled with delight as victory seemed certain due to the first strike he had provided. Putin, looking as serious as ever, ordered his gunners to open fire. At 09:57, the 4 enormous 13-inch guns of Retvizan's main battery fired, one after another, each like a clap of thunder. As the crews hurried to reload the massive cannons, Russian spotters and officers focused on Kentucky, waiting to see where their shots fell. And they didn't land anywhere near the American battleship. In fact, the Americans didn't even notice they were under fire, because right when they would have noticed, Captain Biden announced that it was time for him to take his late morning nap, distracting the crew. Angered at the failure of the surprise attack, although hiding it pretty well, all things considered, Putin ordered the main guns to fire at will. The order passed through the crew via lots of angry shouting through voice pipes, or just shouting in general, and the 13-inch guns continued. On the bridge of the Kentucky, the crew was concerned. After finally realizing they were, in fact, under attack, they made frantic attempts to wake Captain Biden and inform him of the situation. But nope, he was already out. Command passed down to... Crap, I didn't research this. It's Jonathan Frakes, not Riker. It's Jonathan Frakes. Just go with it. Frakes, realizing that this was his moment to step up and take command, dramatically ordered the helm to turn 30 degrees starboard to put the ship's broadside to broadside. Frakes ordered Kentucky's gunners to fire. At 10:06, Kentucky finally returned fire with her 13 and 18-inch guns, and a 13-inch shell hit. Score 1 for Frakes. Although Kentucky got hit too, causing the bridge to shake and sparks to shoot everywhere, as per normal. Frakes demanded a damage report, but had to wait a few minutes while everyone angrily shouted through voice pipes to get answers for him. However, that was when Frakes realized he wasn't sure what to do. He said fire. He asked for a damage report. That's about all he knew how to do, other than finding the captain. So he went to wake up the captain. On board Retvizan, at 10:09, Putin ordered the helm to adjust their heading to stay alongside Kentucky at around 1,200 yards, and for all batteries to fire at will. Soon every gun that could be brought to bear was in action, sending a hail of shell fire at the American ship. However, much to Putin's growing disappointment, very little of it actually hit Kentucky. It was then that Rasputin revealed to Putin his master plan for guaranteeing victory. Before the battle, the sorcerer had placed a sleep forever curse upon the head of Joe Biden that would ensure he slept through all the action. Putin just grinned with delight and nodded his head. After several more minutes of fire from Retvizan, another 13-inch shell struck Kentucky at 10:15, punching through the ship's forward armor, but again failing to do any serious damage. Hoping maybe the impact of the shell would assist him, Frakes made another attempt to wake up Captain Biden. Unfortunately, his efforts were completely in vain. Back on the bridge, Frakes was sweating bullets. The officers looked at him, wondering why he wasn't firing back. Little did they know of Frakes' secret flaw. He couldn't give the order to fire at will, not after the accident with sailor Bill Williams. And seriously, you can't just say fire over and over. You sound like a jackass. At 10:24, Frakes watched as more shells occasionally hit Kentucky, although they failed to penetrate the armor. It was then that Frakes realized Captain Biden was standing alongside him, carrying a warm mug of milk. After doing a double take, Frakes asked the captain what they should do. "My God, man, just shoot them," Biden replied, before retiring back to his quarters. Emboldened, Frakes ordered all guns to fire. Kentucky's guns went into action once more, scoring multiple hits on the Russian battleship. Cheers rang out from the bridge on Kentucky as the shells struck their target. Even Frakes couldn't help but smirk. That was until they asked him for further orders. A few moments of indecision, and Frakes declared that he would go ask the captain, garnering a demoralized groan from the bridge crew. As much of a mess as things were on the bridge of Kentucky, it could not compare to the situation on Retvizan. Putin somehow looked even more pissed off than he usually does. Rasputin's sleep forever spell didn't appear to be as forever as he had promised. The sorcerer pleaded with his captain to give the spell more time, pointing out that Kentucky had once again stopped firing. Putin decided to give the mad warlock one last chance. Several more minutes passed as Retvizan continued firing with everything she had, but only the occasional small-caliber shell ever connected with the American battleship. Nonetheless, Rasputin insisted that everything was going to plan, even giving Vlad a nervous smile and thumbs up anytime he glanced over. Back on Kentucky, Frakes desperately pummeled the door to the captain's quarters, trying as hard as he could to awaken his geriatric commanding officer. He tried everything he could think of, including singing songs from the musical Shenandoah, doing his best Charles Lindbergh impersonation, and explaining the plot of the animated TV series Gargoyles. Since none of these things were culturally relevant in 1904, they failed to shake Biden from his slumber. Defeated, Frakes moped back to the bridge, only to find Biden standing there in a dressing gown, stocking cap, and carrying an oil lamp. Frakes excitedly asked his captain for orders. On Retvizan, Putin and Rasputin waited anxiously for one of their salvos to actually damage the American ship in a serious way. Putin simply tapped his fingers on the railing while Rasputin was sweating, nervously adjusting his collar. Suddenly, Kentucky fired all of her guns once again. In the few seconds that the shells traveled to their target, Putin unamusedly glanced over at Rasputin, but the wizard was gone, having jumped out the window moments earlier. One of Kentucky's 13-inch guns struck Retvizan's stern near the waterline, damaging the rudder and destroying the controls. Then a pair of 8-inch shells slammed into the upper works of the ship, destroying many of the unprotected smaller caliber gun positions. One of the junior officers on the bridge informed Putin that the rudder was locked in position and their course would cause them to run aground in Alaska, but Putin just shrugged it off while quietly contemplating the decisions he had made. Another officer shouted that Kentucky had changed course and would soon be positioned to fire her broadside into Retvizan's stern. Biden had crossed the T. Meanwhile, Frakes was grinning like an idiot as Kentucky slowly steamed into position, anticipating their inevitable victory. As soon as they lined up on Retvizan, Frakes turned to Captain Biden to ask him for orders, only to find him sleeping in an inexplicably placed rocking chair, covered in a patchwork quilt. Frakes cried out some expletives, threw his hat on the ground, and began to stomp on it, then quit the Navy to become an actor and TV personality. Retvizan ended up running aground in Alaska, as predicted, and froze into a glacier. Somehow. Later, the Russians reported the ship as being lost at Port Arthur, although the Japanese did claim to refloat her and commission her as Heezen. I guess they just made that up. I don't know. What I do know is that in 2020, they found Retvizan trapped in a giant ice cube in the North Pole and fought it out, freeing Putin. And while Biden hadn't finished the job to take out Putin, I'm sure old Vlad learned his lesson. Ah, crap. Alright, so let's discuss the events of the simulation and wrap up this video. I needed an American and Russian battleship that were about equivalent. What I ended up doing was choosing a Russian ship, Retvizan, and finding an American ship with similar statistics, which I figured would be easy since both would have been made by American shipyards. Here's the big problem. Russian pre-dreadnoughts had those main guns that fired 50% slower than everyone else, and that's such a serious disadvantage. So to make up for that, I needed an older, less capable American battleship and settled on Kearsarge class because I already wrote up a sheet for them on the previous video. I figured that the older design having an awkward turret layout might make up for the slower firing on Retvizan. In the end, both sides were rolling D100s needing under 20, and Retvizan's main guns were less accurate, but made up for that with faster firing secondary guns. When I played it out, nothing hit for turn after turn. At 10:06, so 4 turns into the battle, both ships hit with their main guns, doing about equal damage, but not causing any criticals. For the next few turns, there were a few hits with secondary and tertiary guns, but no criticals. Kentucky got the worst of it by a slight margin. Then at 10:24, Kentucky's main, secondary, and tertiary batteries all hit and did a fair amount of damage. Again, no criticals, but now Retvizan had taken more damage than Kentucky. Then there's another 12 minutes of missed shots, and the damage from the smaller guns starts to creep up on Kentucky again. Finally, at 10:36, the American ship hits with all of her batteries once again, this time causing 3 critical hits. One was minor flooding, another took out a third of the light anti-torpedo guns on the superstructure, and the last one locked the rudder straight ahead. At that point, Retvizan had taken over 50% damage and could only make 9 knots. I had Kentucky turn to get some raking fire on Retvizan's stern, but I didn't see a point in playing that out. When I had to come up with a narrative, it all just kind of fell into place with Biden taking naps, and I threw Riker into the mix because, it's Riker. I'll throw him in the thumbnail, too. Anyway, thanks for watching. Feel free to hit the like and subscribe buttons, leave a comment, because that's what prods me to keep making these videos.